SAGA Shorts.
Hey subscribers, welcome to part 2 of Multiphase Flow in RTA. In this little video short, I'm going to talk about the numerical model. The numerical model is the workhorse of rate transient analysis. It ties your whole analysis together. Arguably the most important component, that's going to be where we're going to get all the reservoir characteristics and the model that can give us our production forecast. So very, very important. Specifically, what we're going to do is get into some of the important considerations for these oil reservoirs that drop below the bubble point, where we're going to have all these multi-phase flow effects going on. A lot of the classical RTA stuff that's out there, that we've done over the years, has depended on analytical models, and so everything is really single phase. We don't, if there is multi-phase flow in the reservoir, we're sort of ignoring it, which is sometimes okay. But obviously, when we get into a lot of these liquids-rich plays, we can't do that anymore. So the numerical model becomes really important. One of the questions that always comes up is like, how detailed do we need to get into this multi-phase flow? Do we have to have really, really accurate descriptions of these models with 3 dimensions and DFNs and, which are discrete fracture networks? Do we have to go to that level? And I'm not going to tackle that question. That's more of a sort of a philosophical question. What I'm going to say here is we're not talking at that level here. We're talking about a very, very basic single layer, very simplified sort of element of symmetry type numerical model, but extremely powerful in its simplicity. And it will, I've used this model so many times, I know it will handle the things that we need it to handle for the most part. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to reference in here is built into commercially available software that IHS Markit has in the Harmony platform. Some of the content that we have on the SAGA Wisdom platform does detailed examples using these models. So that just kind of paints a picture, puts everything in perspective for you. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, primarily history matching considerations, initializing the model and history matching considerations. Why is initializing the model so important? Well, initializing the model is really how you're setting things up in your starting point. These models can become even simple numerical models can become very cumbersome very quickly if you don't sort of have your grounding in the right place when you're getting started. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that, how we can, pull in the various different components that go into this model, where they come from, what they mean, what assumptions we're making. And then improving that history match, what are all the different considerations there? This is a topic that, if you covered it in detail, is multiple days of examples and different things. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to talk on all of these, various topics at a very high level just to start with. So where does modeling fit into the workflow? We talked a little bit about this before. Way back in 2003, we put this, we came up with this RTA, sort of comprehensive RTA workflow. This workflow hasn't changed appreciably in the last, whatever it is, 18 years, 15 years. The components of all of these individual boxes have changed over time, but the overall workflow is the same. And modeling, in many ways, occupies the same spot. So we do our interpretation and analysis, and then we make some sort of model where we try and reproduce all that data. So when I teach my course, I talk about that in a lot of detail. And this feedback loop is important too, because we have to, sometimes the results of the model don't fit with the interpretations. We have to go back and we sort of have to work the problem multiple times to make sure everything's consistent. But that's really how the model fits into the overall workflow. And then, as I mentioned before, you're going to use that to do production forecasting, which generally is for reserves purposes or running optimization scenarios. Okay, so let's take a look at this black oil numerical model. You can use these models to do gas condensates and volatile oils and things like that as well, more complex systems. What I'm talking about here is just a simple black oil case, of which there's hundreds and thousands of them. So it's a very versatile model. We can use it for really any horizontal well with multiple fracture stages. And as I mentioned before, this comes from, this model is available in a commercial software tool, the IHS Markit Harmony software. All right, so you're seeing a bunch of acronyms here. URM is our unconventional reservoir module. That's in part one, I talked about the specialized plot. Basically, that's where the specialized plot is. So that's where you're going to be able to extract things like your fracture length, your permeability, your dimensionless connectivity of the fracture. Your completion and well data, this is information that really has nothing to do with production analysis and everything to do with just what you know about the completion and the well and pad design. YE is a very important component to this model. That's going to be, the reservoir width. If this is a pad well, then that's a clearly defined number. That's something that needs to be input and understood. And that could have a significant impact, obviously, on your model and your forecast. So we need to get a handle on that. LE and NF are completion and well design parameters. How many fracture stages you have, how long is the lateral. So those are things that need to be entered. The FMB is your flowing material balance. That is probably our best indication of how much contacted oil in place there is. So that's going to be an important initial estimate that we can use to sort of as a guideline to start this model, just to make sure everything's kind of in the right starting place. Type curve analysis, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides, but this is something where we can actually get a little bit of a handle on the EFR properties, the enhanced fracture region properties, so determining how wide that enhanced fracture region around each fracture is, and possibly what the permeability, the effective permeability inside that zone might be. So those are some of your initialization features to create that model. When we are history matching a black oil numerical model, we're really looking at 3 channels. And those 3 channels that we want to history match are the GOR, or gas oil ratio, the WOR, or water oil ratio, and the flowing pressure. And almost without exception, I'm going to set the constraint in the model to oil production rate. So in other words, the model is going to run by simulating the pressure response to a defined oil rate. So that's the PWF response. And then rather than trying to match on things like gas rate and water rate, which are the other fluids being produced, I always use the ratios because they're much more interesting. There's much more going on in the ratio than there is just in the source production rate itself. So those are the 3 channels I'm going to be looking at. Now, what are some of the considerations that we're going to have to think about with these? Well, obviously PVT is going to be a huge thing. And in classical sort of reservoir simulation, the PVT would all be done up front with an equation of state, and you'd have laboratory PVT data. A lot of times in RTA, we don't have that luxury. We're doing a quick production analysis. So I do, sort of what you might call a poor man's PVT in many cases, or field-derived PVT properties. And what I mean by that is I'm going to be using the field measured production data to inform the PVT model more often than I'm going to be using laboratory data to inform the PVT model. And that's usually because I don't have that lab data. Typically, you're not going to have that information available on every single well. And many of these wells start off at initial GORs that are very close to what a laboratory would show anyways, like for RSI, initial solution gas oil ratio. A purist would probably say you should never use PVT as history matching parameters, but a lot of times in RTA work we do. We go back and forth and we make sure that our PVT model is properly calibrated to the actual data we're measuring in the field. That's not a bad thing to do. What about water oil ratio? Well, with water oil ratio, you're always going to have this initial period, especially in these massively hydraulically fractured multi-stage wells. You're going to have this initial period of usually rapidly decreasing WOR. This model that I'm talking about here isn't really going to model that. It doesn't have the physics to, model the frac fluid unloading. You can build models that do cover that if that's something that is important. That would be something that would probably take into the flowback analysis space, which we have a full course on the SAGA Wisdom platform for that as well. For sort of day-by-day production-based RTA, inline production-based RTA, we generally don't worry about that, and we focus on once, that period of time once the water oil ratio becomes flat. And now what we're interested in, to get better matches on that, we're looking at things like water saturation, initial water saturation, and irreducible water saturation, as well as some of the relative permeability shape factors and curves that are going to have a significant impact on that. Sometimes, things like water saturation, those are known parameters and we don't want to mess with them. Other times, like PBT, we don't even have access to that information, and so we're almost using it as a history matching parameter again. So those are some considerations there. Some other things we're going to talk about is relative permeability for gas. That is a critical consideration in almost any black oil case I've ever looked at. The relative permeability to gas is something that has a huge impact on the history match. And a lot of times you have to make some significant changes to those defaults. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We've got some examples to show there. As far as the model inputs, there's some history matching parameters. Again, things like K, XF, FCD, these are ones that we probably don't want to adjust too much. Those have been initialized based on our RTA interpretation. And so we don't want to mess with them too much. We can adjust them minimally to get a better history match. And in rare cases, we might have to change them significantly, but we need to have a reason and make sure that make sure what we're doing makes sense. Things like the permeability in the SRV and the XI, which is the width of the enhanced fracture region, those are usually history matching parameters as well. So we can sort of adjust those to get a better match on flowing pressure, water oil ratio, GOR. And then geomechanical, and I'll show an example of that. That's also something that sometimes comes into play, particularly if pore pressure gradient exceeds 0.75 psi per foot. Okay, a lot to take in there, I realize that, and I just sort of gave you the overall picture. Each one of these subjects, you could have a whole deep dive into each one of them, so I'm really just giving you the tip of the iceberg here. But I'll give you a couple of examples. This is PBT, and this shows you how PBT adjustments can impact that GOR curve, and this is a real data example. So over here on the right-hand side, that GOR curve is shown there in red with the data, which represents the actual measured GOR. And over on the left-hand side, we have our correlation plot, and this is solution gas oil ratio plotted against pressure. So this gives you an idea. The dots that are on that curve are the laboratory PBT data, and the solid lines on that curve or on that plot is the model that we're using, the empirical model. So making adjustments to, for example, to saturation pressure obviously has a huge impact on that GOR response. So you can see when I made that change and increased that saturation pressure, the GOR starts to break away. The model starts to break away from the actual data. Well, that makes sense, right? That shows you how those two things are related. So there's a big impact of changing that saturation pressure. Adjusting the RSI also, it's two sides of the same coin. If we adjust that, we can get a better sort of early time match. And so these are little things that we might have to fiddle with, right? And especially if we don't have a laboratory PBT analysis, we might not even know what that saturation pressure is. So we may have to sort of come into it through calibrating this empirical correlation. With water saturation, as I mentioned, in many cases, we don't have a good estimate of this anyways. Some cases, we can do better with that than others. This is an example where when I was using the water saturation that was given by the petrophysicist, which was 35%, it didn't match the observed data at all. So you can see here at 35%, our water oil ratio is not even in the realm of, not even in the proximity of what the actual well is doing. It's producing a lot more water. So what does that tell me? Well, that tells me that the water saturation is higher than that. So we can increase it at 45%, and then if we bring it up to 55%, we see that goes a little bit too high. So 50% seems to give us something that's a reasonable answer. These are very coarse adjustments, obviously. There's other considerations there. We need to look at the irreducible saturation as well. When does water start to become mobile? And even the shape of that rel-perm curve becomes important as well. Okay, gas rel-perm adjustments. As I mentioned, this is one of the most important considerations because this has a huge impact on GOR. As you can see, if you're using, for example, this KRG here, which is 0.025, that's a very, very low KRG. We get a pretty good match of the data. if I were to bring this back up to a what we call a conventional default in the modified Corey curves, which typically they set to a KRG of 0.5, that's the result we get. So we are in no way even close to matching that GOR to the data anymore. So this is one of the things that, when you look at these multi-fract cases, low permeability fractured reservoirs, you're going to see this sort of behavior quite a lot. For whatever reason, the effective permeability to gas in these systems is very, very, very low, and we can get into some discussions about why that might be the case. There's some theories about that. There's some really good work that different authors have done on that. But suffice to say, this is something we definitely need to include in the model as a history matching parameter. And then in the third case, brought it down even more to suppress that GOR. So we use the term, adjusting the KRG basically to suppress gas breakout or suppress GOR breakout. Okay, let's talk Geomax. Geomax, sort of the term I'm going to use to describe pressure-dependent permeability. So this is a production that where we sort of have this underlying compaction effect that's going on in the reservoir. Obviously very, very common in these tight fractured reservoirs. You're going to have fractures that close, particularly in those cases where we have a high initial pore pressure. So in this example, you can see my pressure match. Now the GOR match at the top and the water match at the bottom are actually pretty good, but the pressure match, and this point in time right here is where the well goes on pump. So there's artificial lift happening there. And you can see the model pressure doesn't really respond the way you would hope it would. We want it to suppress down further and actually match the data that we're seeing there. And it turns out that Geomax does a reasonably good job of getting that match. Now this is one of those cases, just as a warning, where that's absolutely a non-unique result. There could be other things I do to lower that history match as well. So we need to be careful. A collection of input parameters that gives you a picture-perfect history match such as this does not necessarily guarantee that that is the right answer or the right model. There could be multiple, especially in these complex models, there could be multiple different configurations and different assumptions that sort of all conspire to give you a good quality history match, and they might not necessarily all look the same. Just quickly, let me talk about how the type curve match can sometimes inform the decision of what the EFR region looks like. I'm using the term EFR. If you're not familiar with that, the EFR is the enhanced fracture region. So I've zoomed into it here. It's this little white box that's around each fracture. So what we're essentially assuming there is that every fracture stage has created this enhanced fracture region. This is something that obviously there's no way to independently measure this. There's no petrophysical log data that's going to tell you this. There's no core data that's going to tell you this. There's no PVT information that you're going to get this from. So the EFR is always a history matching parameter in the model. So it's something that the data will sort of help you back into. And again, it's not a direct measurement. It's usually a history matching parameter. But the type curve, the compound linear flow type curves will help you get a handle on this in many cases. It will give you an idea, not so much of the magnitude of the EFR, but certainly its shape. So if you think of this EFR region as being long and narrow, or possibly shorter and skinnier, or shorter and wider, the type curve match will give you some indication of that. So in this example, and these curves aren't labeled, but we've matched on one of these curves, so it's given you sort of a qualitative picture of what that aspect ratio looks like, and we can relate that back to EFR behavior, and we do that successfully in many of these tight oil examples. Okay, so that just again gives you some highlights. There's a lot of information there, but in conclusion, for this video short, numerical model again is the workhorse of the multi-phase RTA interpretation. Ties everything together. We talked about a bunch of different things. We talked about PVT, relative permeability, geomechanical considerations, and the EFR behavior. These are all components that are important in the numerical model. They'll have a huge impact in many cases on the forecast. So as we mentioned, also the numerical model can give us sort of what we think is our best answer for reservoir description. Again, just be aware that can be very non-unique. There's much more to learn here, okay? So other questions you might have: how does uncertainty impact complex numerical models? We touched on that a little bit. There's obviously a lot more to do there. On the full SAGA Wisdom subscription for the RTA course, there's an entire chapter on uncertainty and using probabilistic workflows for RTA, where we get into that with detailed examples. What about other common multi-phase systems? Gas, condensates, volatile oil. Again, we've got lots of case studies on the platform where we go into multiple different examples. The one we covered here was just black oil. Even more importantly, what are the specific considerations for my specific play? I gave you some general examples here, but if you're working in the Delaware Wolfcamp, if you're working in the Eagle Ford, if you're working in the Marcellus, if you're working in the Scoop Stack, these all have different considerations, especially when you're initializing that model. And the assumptions that you make for the PVT and the assumptions that you make for geomechanical properties and relative permeability curves are somewhat different depending on what play and basin that you're in. We've compiled a huge amount of data and history and examples that go through and look at every play on an individual basis for RTA, and these are all available on the full subscription as well. And then I guess finally, how can I better understand the fundamentals? In both of these video shorts on multiphase, I've talked about some of the equations from a very basic level. We have deep dives on the SAGA Wisdom platform, which go into a ton more detail on this. There's quiz questions, so you can ensure that you have competency in the area. There's a lot more material available. So if you enjoyed that video, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want more information about the SAGA Wisdom platform and getting your company hooked up to this wealth of knowledge that's available, hit us up at info@sagawisdom.com.